Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the fourth seminar of the 2021 ROK-US Think Tank Seminar Series. The title of today's seminar is Media and Public Opinion, ROK-US Relations from the Perspective of Korean Media. My name is Alec Chung. I am a research director at the Jeju Peace Institute, the host organization of this seminar, and I'll be the moderator today. And this 2021 ROK-US Think Tank Seminar Series is a project funded by the Republic of Korea Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And before we begin, I need to inform you that I'll be wearing my mask throughout the seminar because we need to follow the COVID-19 protocol. And I'm not alone in this room, and I haven't been vaccinated twice yet. So I'll try to speak as loudly as possible so my voice won't sound like some mumbling, but please excuse me for this. But if you are already vaccinated, or if you are in an isolated place, alone in your apartment or alone in your office, then it will be okay to participate without wearing your mask. Okay, so moving on. As the title of today's seminar implies, today we are going to have discussions regarding how South Korean media describe the US-South Korea relations, how different media describe the same event differently, or how media can shape how we perceive certain issues or topics by framing and mediating messages differently, or how media determines which information reaches to the public and which information does not. So for instance, back in May 2021, President Moon of South Korea and President Joe Biden of the US held a summit meeting. And did the Moon-Biden summit reaffirm that the US-South Korea alliance is robust? Or did the summit reveal that there's a serious crack in the alliance and that the US-South Korea relations are not as good as it used to be, or not as good as people thought? You might come across with different answers depending on which media and news you read, watch, or hear. And we will also discuss how newspapers with different political orientation portrays the US and the US-South Korea relations differently. Whether different media platforms, like traditional media and social media like YouTube, cover different agendas. And finally, when were the historical change points regarding how Korean media describe the US and the US-South Korea relations? Well, we cannot deny that media has a huge influence on shaping the public's views, thoughts, and perceptions towards certain issues, or on shaping an overall image of a certain country like the US. Because we all read or hear about a certain issue or a country through what the media release, publish, or live broadcast. Unless you work at a government agency or a government bureau and you have someone, a source who can provide you an unfiltered information to you. Thus, understanding how media portrays a specific issues, topics, and how that might shape our perceptions, perspectives, and beliefs are important because it could shape public opinion. We could indirectly also affect government's foreign policies toward other countries, especially in democracies like South Korea. So regarding the topics, we have 2 distinguished presenters and 3 distinguished discussants for today's seminar. First speaker is Professor Byung-Jae from the Center for the Digital Social Science at Yonsei University. And second speaker is Professor Hyun from School of Communication at Kookmin University. Our first discussant is Mr. Tim Martin, Korea Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. And our second discussant is Professor Jeeyoung from Department of Political Science at Sungshin Women's University. And finally, our third discussant is Associate Director Yonho Institute for Korean Studies at George Washington University. Thank you everyone for participating in today's seminar. So here's how we are going to proceed. Two presenters will have a maximum of 20 minutes each for their presentation. So that will be 40 minutes in total. Then after the two presentations, three discussants will have a maximum of 10 minutes each to comment on the presentations. That would be 30 minutes in total. Then after the comments, presenters will again have 5 to 10 minutes each to respond to the comments they got from the discussants. Then if we have some time left, we'll have an open discussion before we wrap up this seminar. And before we begin, please mute your microphone when you're not speaking. Thank you. So without further ado, let's welcome our first presenter, Professor Byung-Jae. The title of the presentation is Korea-US Relations in Korean News Media. Professor Lee, you have 20 minutes in maximum. Thank you.
Thank you for having me as a presenter, and it's very delightful to have the presentation like this. Thank you for having me, inviting me for this event again. And today I'm going to talk about the Korea-US relations in Korean news media. And when I was asked to present about this issue, actually, I thought it was a too huge task. And upon the hearing, the moderator already said, I think I'm afraid that I'm not up to the task of describing, including discussions about all the kinds of the media, including the social media. But I'll try to do it my best. So at the age of the social media and including the podcast or YouTube, so it's not actually possible to analyze all kinds of the news media for this short presentation. So mostly I will be focusing on the main newspapers in South Korea. So here is just brief the order of the presentation. At first, I'm just going to talk about some historical issues. I'm not going to stick too much about that issue, and then the changing Korean people's favorability on the U.S. and then motivating questions and sorry about the typo D, and then then are going to describe some data that I'm going to use for this analysis, and then the next step is the historical change points in Korean newspapers. So whether there is a structural break or systematic changes in dealing with the Korea-US relations news reflected in the Korean newspapers, from 1990 to 2021, and then I will compare the yearly changes of the keywords in Korean newspapers, partisan newspapers, usually the conservative newspapers and the progressive newspapers, and then the keywords in Korean government. So from 2003, Hyun government to until now, the Moon-jae-in government. So main keywords in Korean newspapers, and then if time allows, I will briefly talk about some keyword in the year of the 2021, because some interesting the keyword emerged in 2021, and finally I will talk about some implications or discussions. So if you need some clarification about any part of my presentation, please let me know. So as we all know from the history of the Korea-US relations, there was a lot of the encounters between the United States and Korea, but the General Sherman and the Treaty of the United States and Taft-Castro Memorandum, but these were some of the remote ancient encounters between these two countries. But Most of the questions that we have heard about the Korea-US relations are related to these kind of the issues, as the Professor Park wrote about with this title on ally or empires, so whether the United States came to Korea as a liberator or occupier or something like that, and as the Professor Shin in Stanford says, the one alliance with two lenses or something like that. So these kinds of the contrasting views are expressed by the according to the political orientations and political positions. And in this year, there was another the provocative statement about the nature of the Korea-US relations by the Professor Kim Jun-hyung, and the eternal alliance, the paradox of the eternal alliance or gaslighting. So in this situation, I thought that it could be very interesting to compare whether the descriptions reflected in the Korean partisan medias, even if the analysis will be limited to a set of the newspapers. So before we begin I begin talk about the analysis. Here is interesting the data, quite popularly cited data. Pew Research Center's the favorability the data. So it says that the Korean people's favorability on the US from 2003 to 2019. And the blue one shows that the confidence in US president. So the lowest point in terms of the Korean favorability is around the early 2000, as we all know that the Yangju Highway incident or the Salt Lake Olympic scandal or that kind of things occurred at this time. And again, but from the 2010, it began to increase. But interestingly, the confidence in US president fluctuates quite a lot compared to the Korean favorability on the US. So especially noteworthy is the lower confidence rate in the US president in this period, as we know, in the era of the President Trump. And another point here is that the late 2000s, that was when the US beef scandal or was the rampant issue. And so at the time, still relatively speaking, the favorability toward the US was higher compared to the early 2000s, but the confidence in the US president was low. So this just background, and then the questions that I'm going to talk about is that how Korean newspapers have described in the US using the available data, and do the partisan media or have the polarizing views on the US with so conservative media and liberal media, whether they describe the US-Korea relations differently. So to analyze that, I collected the data using the big kinds from the Joseon, the conservative news media, and two progressive or liberal, depending how you define the two newspapers from the big kinds. But unfortunately, Joseon, the archie conservative media in Korean media spectrum, the data from the Joseon newspaper is only available from 2018. So I excluded the Joseon newspapers from the analysis for the historical change point. So basically, the data I collected were ranges from the 1990 to 2021. But and I mostly collected these data using the keyword like the Korea-US, Hanmi, but unfortunately, they produced a lot of the results which are not related to the Korea-US relations, including the Hanmi Bank or something. So I had to exclude those words. So these are the new number of news articles on Korea-US relations monthly changes. So frequencies of the numbers of the newspaper articles. As you can see, there are some the spikes, isolated spikes here and here, and in terms of the overall changes, we can see that compared to the 1990s, there were some structural changes, overall increase from the 2000s and another increase from 2010. So because we cannot see the pattern clearly here, so these are the yearly changes from 1990 to 2021. So it says that some increase in the Kim Dae-jung administration and the George Bush administration. That is the late 1990 and early 2000s. These are the period when the North Korea and the South Korean summit were held. And then here again, the 2007 or 8, these are when the another summit meeting between South Korean president and the North Korean leader was held, and the beef protest, U.S. beef related protests were rampant in this period. And then again, 2011 and 12, that is when the FTA was ratified and the beginning to be the work. And again, the very interesting thing is that from 2017, a huge increase is observed. That is when the President Trump began his term in early 2017. So Trump was the difference maker in terms of the newspaper articles frequency. So I divided the entire data with according to the newspapers, and these are the Donghwa, one of the conservative newspapers. But the pattern is shows the similar pattern. Some increase in here, 2002 and 3. That is when the presidential campaign was held for the 2002, and when the Yangju highway incident occurred. And then 2007 and 8 was the year and the U.S. beef protest was held. Again, FTA, and it shows the another increase spike when the President Trump began his term. Not because President Trump began his term, but because there was just some series of the relations, the opening of the dialogue with the North Korea. So Jeeyoung, another conservative newspaper, shows the very strange pattern. There were a lot of the newspapers in early 1990s, and most of the discussions were about the OPCON operational control, wartime operational, the peacetime operational control transfer issue, and the defense cost sharing discussions about issues. Those issues were held at this time, but the numbers of the articles about the Korea-US relations were relatively scarce here. But certainly 2017 the increase. And one of the conservative, the progressive liberal newspaper shows that the spike in 2008 when the U.S. beef protest was quite strong, and then again 2017 the President Trump's term, so another spike. But you can see if we just say that, judge from the 한겨레's newspaper articles, there was a clear structural break and structural changes in some area at this period, because the systemically the numbers of the articles are different from here and here. And similar patterns appeared in Gyeongyang on other progressive newspapers here, so significantly changed from the 2008 on. So to combine these graphs, it shows that the black line shows the numbers of the newspaper articles by Donga newspaper, and the blue one Jungang. So and the orangey Hangyeore and the red one Gyeongyang. So orangey and red one are the progressive newspapers, and the black and blue one conservative newspapers. And this pattern shows that these two newspapers, Jungang and the Donga, the conservative newspapers, the numbers of the articles in those two newspapers significantly, dramatically increased when the President Trump began his term in 2017. So I'll be moving a little bit quickly. So using this data, I performed some series of the change point analysis, and change point analysis is one of the time series techniques that to determine whether there was a structural or the systematic changes in terms of the newspaper articles. So if we perform the change point analysis on Donga newspapers, we can observe possibly there were three change points. One is the 1990 to 1991, and second one is the 1999 and 2000, and third change point is the 2005 and 2006. So probably the most significant changes in the Donga newspaper is 1999 to 2000. So sometime here. So because the black one is the Donga newspaper, so structural changes here. That is the most significant structural changes in Donga newspapers. And the Jungang newspaper shows that the three structural changes. One is the 1919 to 1994, and the second one is 1995, and third is 2016. So clearly it shows that the blue one is the 2016. There was a significant changes in Jungang newspapers in terms of the newspaper reporting on the Korean-US relations. And the next, the progressive media case, the Hangyeore's case, there was actually only one structural point, 2006 to 2008. That is when the beef protests were quite strong in Korean society. So there was the clear structural change point. As you can see, the Hangyeore newspapers, the orange one. So here at this time, before that, the newspaper articles can be divided for Hangyeore between before 2006 or 7 and after 2006 and 7. So, and then Gyeongyang newspaper is says the three structural point, one 1991, and second one is 2005 and 2008. So overall, if we combine these results, some structural changes in terms of the Korean newspaper reportings, if we decide by the numbers of the newspaper articles, occurred sometime before 2010. So then the next step is the keyword changes for each of these newspapers from 1991 to 1992. So just show a little bit more clearly. So the left one is the Donga newspaper from 1990 to 2021. So mostly these newspaper articles include the term the president And the Jeeyoung newspaper, another conservative newspaper, also have the president. And 2017, the President Trump. And for the limited years from 2018 to 2021, this is the Joseon newspaper. And the next is the 한겨레 from 1991 to 2021. So mostly it says about the U.S. Army forces in Korea, or the middle school students. That means that the Yangju Highway incident 2002. Yeah, and another Korean the liberal newspapers that says the defense cost sharing, and so it says that their emphasis over the years are slightly different. So then the next step that I took was to compare the keywords in each the administration. So Roh Mi-hyun presidency from 2003 to 2007, it says that the FTA, Screen Quarter, and the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs, and these are some of the keywords: anti-Americanism, and the Kim Hyun-jong, and the wartime operational control, that kind of things were the most widely discussed topic, USTR. And the Lee-Myung-bak presidency from 2008 to 2012 is that also FTA, and President Obama, and the Kirk, Representative Kirk, and the ratification, or the G20. So the FTA was still the most the widely discussed topic at this time. And then Park Geun-hye president, that was cut short. FTA was also a big topic, but the renegotiation was the issue. And one of the interesting points that I want to emphasize is that in the newspaper articles that discuss the Korea-US relations, the China began to be mentioned here. So that was very interesting finding. The Moon-jae-in presidency, that says that the Ministry of Defense and the Ulchi Freedom Guardian, and the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and again here Kim Yo-jong, North Korea's Kim Yo-jong is first included for the first time, and SMA, and again China is also included here, interestingly. So if we compare these four presidencies, the FTA took the central stage in the first two presidencies, and the Park Geun-hye presidency and Moon-jae-in presidency, you can see that the North Korean denuclearization issue took the central stage here. And one of the notable findings is that the China began to be included in from the Park Geun-hye administration. So lastly, I'll be talking a little bit about the 2021, because this is the year when the United States changed its president from Trump to Biden. And Joseon, Donghwa, Jungang, Hangyeol, and Gyeongyang. So these are some of the frequent the keywords that have the high correlation with the Korea-US relations. So Joseon's case, the Rapson, the person's name in the US embassy. Then interestingly, gaslighting is included here. And the Donghwa did not mention gaslighting, but the non-aggression agreement. And the Jungang says the Kang Kyung-hwa, the Minister of the Foreign Affairs, former. And again, the gaslighting, and Kim Jun-hyung, the author of the book that ignited this debate on gaslighting. And Hangyeol, this did not mention the gaslighting, but 경향 also, it says the gaslighting and interestingly, the 불균형, the inequality or the non-symmetry is included first time included in this in the list of the keywords which has the high correlations with Korea-US relations in the year of the 2021. So these are the some bits of the analysis that I performed with the 4 or 5 Korean newspapers. So in summary, there was some I found that there were some historical changes in throughout the Korean history from 1990 to 2021, the early 1990s and the late 2000s and late 2010s. So these periods have the different the issues, but the most crucial change point occurred late 2000s and sometime between the middle of the 2000s and the end of the 2000s. And as we can see, the most frequently used keyword is the president in across all newspapers. So that means that the Korean newspapers tend to just report what the US president says and what the Korean president says. And so there were no other important news that did not mention the president on the either side. And out of the 5, the President Clinton and Bush and the Obama, Trump and Biden. Obama and Trump were the most frequently mentioned US president. And the opcon transfer and defense budget sharing and US FK, the withdrawal, these were the issues that were most frequently discussed, but not always. So these issues were discussed in early 1990s and again in the early part of the Trump presidency. And the emphasis on beef and FTA in 2000s were different. So usually the liberal and progressive media emphasized more about the beef, the US beef and FTA in 2000s. And the China began to be mentioned along with the Korea-US relations from the Park and Moon presidency. And interestingly, the gaslighting was mentioned in Joseon, Jungang, and Gyeongyang, these 3 newspapers, mostly the partisan newspapers in a different direction. And from the Moon presidency, Kim Yo-jong began to be included as a key as one of the key terms. So these are some of the tentative findings that I found using the 5 Korean newspapers about the Korea-US relations. So thank you for listening, and that's all for my presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Yeah. Now let's welcome our second presenter, Professor Hyun. Yeah. The title of the presentation is Relations between Korea and US in Korean Newspaper and Social Media, focus on the Korea-US Summit. Professor Hong, you have 20 minutes in maximum. Thank you.
Yes, nice to meet you. My name is Yonho, as I mentioned in my introduction. Before my presentation, I want to say thank you for giving me a good opportunity to present on the analysis of newspaper for exploring how Korean newspaper describes the relationship between Korea and the US. My presentation is like this. The title is Relations between 2 countries, how newspaper describes the pending issues between 2 countries. As you know, there are lots of pending issues between 2 countries. For example, missile fires, the joint South Korea-US military exercise. Recently, we have another issue on the end of world decolorization. However, among these issues, I focused on the Korea-US summit. Content is like this. Because lack of time, I want to focus on research results and conclusion. Yes, and as you know, use of relations between Korea and the US is the main concern of researchers. According to the preceding research, the main important factor is which affects the agenda and the tone of news is political tendency. Here we can see Son and Hong's study. According to Son and Hong's study, conservative media and the progressive media frame the pending issues between Korea and the US differently. So based on Son and Hong's study and previous study, in this study, political tendency of news organization is also important. In this study, content analysis is used because content analysis is a useful method for finding out the media coverage. And so we can find something important by content analysis. This slide shows a theoretical background. In view of the lack of time, I'm going to this part briefly. Please refer to the slide on details of the theoretical background. According to the emergence of social media, today people can produce messages themselves and easily share lots of information with each other. Because because anyone can access to social media. So today agenda setting theory is changing. Agenda setting in agenda theory, it emphasizes the role of media. However, today social media becomes an important tool to search information and news. So most of media are running their own YouTube channels. So this study also focused on the YouTube channel. We have two theories to explain how this is making. One is frame theory and the other one is reading the messages of shoemaker reads. Frame theory explains there are lots of elements which compose of the reality. Here, the reality means the world we live in. However, media cannot cover all the things because of lack of time and reporters, restrictions of reporters. However, all of media have to produce news every day. So media cannot cover all the things. So media has to select something important and exclude something unimportant. When media select something, select and exclude some elements, they have their own criteria. And here, reason shoemakers explain this criteria by layer model. So when media, for example, the layer model, they present lots of criteria, for example, in individual level, in media routine level, in organizational level, in society level, in nation level, in ideology. There are lots of factors which can influence the messages. Among these issues, this study focused on the political tendency, political orientation of the news organization. And I have two research questions. One is related with newspapers, how Korean newspaper frame relations between Korea and US differently. And the other question is related with the YouTube channel, which agenda is spreading through YouTube. Is there any different agenda among channel type of YouTube? This slide shows research method for exploring how news media frame pending issues between two countries. This study selected two newspapers. One is Joseon. Joseon's political tendency is conservative, and then the other one is Gyeongyang. Gyeongyang is progressive. I collected very small data. However, I want to see in detail. And this table shows YouTube data. I collected YouTube data by using Node-XL. Node-XL is a tool which is useful to analyze people to activate on social media, for example, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and so on. So in the view of the time and computer capacity, I limited the number of YouTube videos to 400. So I collected 397, and their interaction is very large. So the number of total ads is 262,695. So the data is very large, I think. Yeah, from now on, I want to explain my research result. This slide shows the result of conservative newspapers semantic network analysis of headline. Here you can see vaccine swap. It is related with the pending issue, and you can see red letters directly concern human rights. Here I can find the positive word in the news agreement and certainty secure. All of them are related with the President Biden's government. And on next slide, I want to explain more detail about the negative words. Yes, and I can find the 44 trillion and illusion. So we can see the conservative newspaper underestimated the achievement of the summit of President Moon's. And the main news source is the opposing party. As you know, the political tendency of the opposing party is the same to the conservative newspaper. Yeah, here is the graph network, semantic network graph. Based on this, I can find in case of a conservative newspaper, their main agenda is vaccine swap. Of course, the conservative newspaper distrusted the achievements of vaccine swap, so they criticized the result of vaccine swap. So in this paper, vaccine swap was used negatively. And 44 trillion of Samsung, SKLG, and then human rights. I think the human rights of North Korea is very sensitive issue. However, in conservative newspaper, they emphasize the human rights of North Korea. And main actor is two countries at the opposition party. And in this paper, they described the relations between Korea and US as support, discussion, or dialogue. In this graph, the more purple it is, the larger the value of degree centrality, and the size of node shows the value of between its centrality, because there is a big difference of the value of between its centrality. So I want to show the value of between its centrality of node. Yes, and then if you look at word-to-word connection, you can see the difference between President Moon's and Biden's. I want to show the relationships based on President Moon and President Biden. In case of President Moon is related with President Moon vaccine, Moon swap, and Moon 44 trillion, Moon the opposition party. Based on this, we can find out the opposition party ridiculed the result of the summit, and so according to the conservative newspaper, they think thanks to 44 trillion financial aid of Samsung, LG, SK President Moon could get some notable achievement in the summit meeting. Yeah, and in case of Biden support, you can find Biden support. I'm very interested in this word because in this paper, President Biden's support is very important in carrying out a relation with North Korea, in carrying out the achievement of the summit. So because President conservative newspaper cannot trust the announcement of President Moon's, according to the conservative newspaper. It is not my opinion. Yes, and then they so the conservative newspaper thought highly of President Biden's support policy toward North Korea, so we can find Biden's support. And then in this paper, they emphasized the diplomacy of President Biden toward North Korea, to say Biden concern. This slide shows the result of progressive newspapers. It is totally different from the result of conservative newspapers. You can find, yes, totally different. Washington, the Arlington National Cemetery. In progressive newspaper covers different agenda. You can see Pyongyang focused on all the official schedule of President Moon's. And then the main news source is in this paper is the Democratic Party partnership wedding ring. Yes, and the representative of the Democratic Party says wedding ring, follow-up action and regularize. And in this paper, vaccine is very very positive word, and they focused on cooperation. I cannot find a negative word in Pyongyang based on top 10 influential words. And this is the graph, and you can see Summit and Korea-US in the middle of this network. You can find Democratic Party, Byung-Jae arrival, schedule, a visit to the US, yes, and the cooperation partnership. All of the words are positive. So, and in this paper, all of President Moon's actions receive attention, I think. And in conclusion, I want to compare the tone of news. So the agenda of news between conservative newspaper and progressive newspaper. Red letters means negative things and blue letters means positive things. In case of conservative newspaper, these three items, issues, comparing joint South Korea-US military, the reactions and assessments of anti-communist leftists, human rights, all three of these issues were covered before the summit. And after the summit, we can find like this criticism of the President Moon's narcissism and crackhead luncheon to the value of 44 trillion. And because the conservative newspaper ridiculed the achievements of the President Moon's visit to the US like this, and they think they exchange the achievements of the summit with 44 trillion financial aid. In case of a progressive newspaper, there are many positive words I can find: cooperation alliance, vaccine alliance, and the reaction of a party in power. And however, I can find Justice Party's criticism on the visit to the US of President Moon's. Justice Party is the opposition, another opposition party. They criticize there is no plan of Korean nuclear weapons and no unprecedented support of vaccine. And we are going to find positive image and negative image in Korean newspaper. All of the negative image is formed by conservative newspaper, and positive image is formed by progressive newspaper. And I cannot find any negative image of US like this. Positive image cooperation alliance vaccine, and they applaud the achievements of President Moon's and reaction of a party in power. yes, and launching expert group, the emphasis on performance. There is on emphasis on performance, and in negative image, we can find illusion narcissism. Based on illusion narcissism concern, I can find the criticism frame, and sometimes there is no plan of Korean nuclear weapons, and they mentioned very sensitive issues like human rights of North Korea. And most of, so the US government, in conclusion, I think the US government was described in conservative newspaper as seeking a practical diplomacy. Yes, and then from now on, I want to explain the result of YouTube video network. In this network, influential videos are located in the middle, like this. Node size shows the value of between its centrality, because there is a big difference between the value of between its centrality. The higher the value of between is, the larger the node size. Yes, and then this is the result of 397 videos. This table shows the top top 10 influential videos. The author is like this: MBC, KTV, YTN. Yes, and the political tendency of course, political tendency of MBC News and YTN is not progressive. However, they have a pro-government tendency. I think so. Their tone of news is positive, or all of them are focused on the visit to the US and the historical sites of President Moon's visit. So in this videos, we can find the most viewed video. The most viewed video is KTV's. Yes, and then all of tone of their title is positive. You can see. And this graph shows the result of group analysis. To compare agenda among YouTube channels, this study categorized the YouTube channel into three. Yes, in politician is included in personal channel. In case of a personal channel, their political tendency is progressive. You can see jackpot, and then they focused on the reaction of China and comparison, and they also compare the achievement of summit with Japan's. And among personal channel, An Chul-soo, who once he was the strongest presidential candidate of the opposition party, he also, in his YouTube channel, he criticized the achievement of the summit. He used the empty wagon, which is plenty, and influential government channel. All of channel has a positive attitude on the summit. A favorable response of US meeting Korean resident abroad joint press conference. Media channel, of course, top 10 influential media channel has a positive attitude on the summit. However, in case of conservative media channel, their attitude is the same to the attitude of conservative newspaper. Yes, and then discussion. In discussion, just like the previous studies, this study, yes, and the highlights political tendency, and based on the result of YouTube network analysis, the result is the same. So agenda between traditional media channels, social media agenda of personal and progressive media were not different to each other. In case of YouTube network analysis, I think the political tendency of YouTube channel is also important too. So pro-government channel and progressive channel. Yes, and then they focused on the achievements and they applaud the achievement of the visit to the US. And however, anti-government channel also criticized and underestimated the achievement of the summit. So yes, and then conservative broadcasting channel expressed negatively on the result visit to the US. In conclusion, I think when Korean newspaper covered the pending issues between two Koreas, news media's political tendency is the most important thing. Historically, as you know, there is a huge difference in North Korea problem and the rule of US. So, and when media cover relations between Korea and US or the North Korea issue, media have to consider national interest first originally, but it is not. Conservative media focused on the support of US in carrying out the achievement of the summit because the opposition party and conservative media, I think, couldn't trust President Moon's announcement on the result of the summit. Yes, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hong, for your wonderful presentation. And let's move on to discussions. Yeah. So our first discussant is Mr. Tim Martin, the Korea Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal. Chief Martin, are you ready? Please feel free to use your 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah, it looks like we're running a bit over, so I'll try to keep this as brief as possible to allow a full conversation among all of us. But thank you for the invitation. My name is Timothy Martin. I'm the Korea Bureau Chief at the Wall Street Journal. So we cover both North and South Korea. I've been based in Seoul for the past 5 years, and it's been a very busy time from almost immediately when I showed up, the Samsung phones had just exploded, and the Samsung de facto leader, J.Y. Lee, went to prison, and then fire and fury, nuclear summits with Trump and Kim, COVID-19, and on you go. So I was very interested to hear Professor Lee's research about the volume of South Korea-US relations, the coverage about that bilateral relationship and how it's really risen up in recent years. And I think that mirrors what I'm seeing from foreign press in Korea on a couple fronts. One, I think there are more reporters out here covering Korea, but also I think the range of topics and the global awareness of them is also at an all-time high. I don't think there's ever been more interest in all things Korea, North or South, cultural or security than we have right now. And I can attest to that. I have been busy all the 5 years I've been out here. I've always thought, things would slow down, but they haven't. So I think that reflects a couple of things, not only the US-South Korea relationship, but everything going on with pop culture from Parasite to BTS, South Korea's role in critical industries like the semiconductor production, and from whether you're a foreign news outlet in China or the U.S. or Europe, Korea is just seemingly involved in some of the most pressing stories nationally. Now, I will say, of all these elements, clearly North Korea is and remains a central focus. And when you're looking at this through the prism of foreign media rather than domestic South Korean media, the US South Korea relationship is often viewed through the prism of the North Korea issue. There are times when we focus on military cost sharing, for instance, or some tariff deals, free trade deals, but generally when we're talking about Moon-Jae and Biden or Moon-Jae and Trump, it's usually about what they're doing on related to North Korea. And I'll just make one quick point before I ask a question to Professor Lee. One very interesting element to the global media industry is sort of the unquenchable thirst readers around the world have for Kim Jong-un. I think the statistic I recall seeing is that Kim Jong-un was the world's second most Googled person in 2020, second only to Joe Biden. And that extends to just any story about North Korea. And this is perhaps getting a bit meta, but I spent most of the morning writing a story about Kim Jong-un and North Korea in the prelude to this session. So if we think about the Professor Lee's research and we look at the amazing data he had done, or data collection he had done, I wonder if I could ask Professor Lee, we've seen this uptick in coverage about US ROK relations. And you also did a great job at showing the different politicization of the various news outlets, whether they're left-leaning or right-leaning. And I just wonder, as there's more interest in that relationship with the US, are you seeing, like, what is the trajectory of the buzzwords or the tone of the coverage? Are they, I wonder if they're converging, you know, as there's more volume, as there's more news, are they getting more polarized or are they converging? And I'm curious what you've seen in recent years as part of your research, and I'm curious what your thoughts might be projecting forward, if you think we'll see things splinter even more, or if the news will read more of the same on this topic that everyone seems to want to read more and more about.
Are you finished, Chief Martin? Yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Chief Martin. And moving on to our second discussant.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeeyoung Park, Assistant Professor at Sungshin Women's University. Thank you for having me for this seminar. Before starting my discussion, let me share my screen. I think Professor Hong's study is very interesting in several ways. First of all, she analyzed how conservative and liberal newspapers have different attention on the May 2021 Moon-Biden summit. She found that news media report a political issue in a biased way, depending on their ideological position. So it seems to me that this is important because the way media report political issues may cause mass political polarization. Secondly, in the past, a major disadvantage of the content analysis of newspaper articles required considerable time and human resources. Actually, it depends on human hand coding, but computer-assisted text analysis and network analysis she used in this study allow us to reduce the cost of content analysis. Even we can use network data from social media using similar technique. Finally, she found that there is no difference between legacy news media like newspapers and new media in terms of reporting partisan issues. It means that both media make people so polarized. Okay, let's move on to my comment and discussion question. First question. This study only looked at a single case about the May 2021 Moon-Biden summit. So I'm wondering why you did not compare this case with other Korea-US summit in order to examine the partisan media frames. In particular, if you examine how news media reported Moon-Trump summit compared to Moon-Biden summit, I think it would be more interesting and meaningful because you can figure out how Korean conservative and liberal news media respond to the ruling party of the United States. I think you may find a variation between under Trump administration and under Biden administration. This is the second question. When it comes to the group analysis of YouTube channels, you categorize YouTube channel into 4 groups: personal channel, politician, government channel, and media channel. So I'm wondering if there is any reason why you sort out them like them. Even if I don't look at the result, it's too obvious that YouTube channel to receive national support and liberal personal channel will emphasize the positive side of government performance and support the government decision. But anti-government channel, conservative personal channel, and opposition politicians like An Chol-soo try to depreciate the government performance and emphasize the negative side. So in my opinion, for consistency with previous analysis in using network analysis of newspapers, I think you had better classify YouTube channels depending on their ideological position, because pro-government channel can belong to liberal channels during the Moon administration period. So you can evaluate YouTube channels on the same basis. Okay, this is question 3. This study showed how liberal and conservative media report Moon-Biden summit in a different way. But I cannot see how much the partisan media influenced the public in this study. So I think it's very important that how media frames move public opinion, or how people perceive media frames. So to check framing effect, I think you need to pay attention to the way people select news story today and how the media environment can influence who receive the frames. So for this future study, if you examine the causal relationship between media frame and public perceptions of political issues using empirical analysis, I think it would be great to look at the concept to framing theory or hostile media perceptions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Park, and sorry for the short awkward pause. Yeah, instead of introducing you to others. Yes, I've been distracted a little bit. Sorry, and thank you. And moving on to our final and third discussion, Associate Director Kim Yonho. Yeah. Director Kim, you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Since Tim and Jeeyoung already make their comments on the presentations by Professor Lee and Hong, if I may, I can just add one simple thing. I think Professor Lee and Hong provided excellent systematic analysis of what we assume to be true, the fluctuating media attention, depending on the major developments in Korea and in the relations between the US and ROK, and also the political bias of conservative and liberal media. So I think the next question would be whether and how these research results impacted the national debates on the US-ROK relations and the policy directions of the Korean government. I think that this requires another big webinar, so hopefully we can have another chance to discuss this topic. And moving on, let me share briefly with you what I observed in Washington regarding the Korean news media's reporting on the US policy toward the Korean Peninsula. As Professor Lee said in his presentation, Obama and Trump, especially Trump, must be the most frequently mentioned US president in the Korean news media. From the very beginning of his term, or even during the presidential campaign in 2016, Trump's unconventional leadership style attracted a great amount of media attention from all over the world, including Korea. And to his credit, Trump's approach to North Korea was a major break from the past pattern of the US approaches. He sought, in a way, fundamental solutions at the top level at an early stage of US domestic political cycle, although he didn't have a clear strategy of how to follow up. And Trump's unconventional presidency allowed himself to be free from traditional political taboos that restrained US policy toward North Korea. So during the presidential campaign, he said he was open to meeting Kim Jong-un over hamburger. Presidential candidate Obama also said he will meet with Kim Jong-il without any preconditions. But he walked back after fierce attacks from Hillary Clinton during the primary and by the Republican presidential candidate John McCain. In contrast, Trump didn't walk back. he faced a bombardment of criticism when he moved back and forth like a pendulum with extreme rhetoric from Kim Jong-un, a smart cookie, to fire and fury. But his consistent message to Kim Jong-un was that he wanted to make a big deal with Pyongyang. The so-called bloody nose strategy turned out to be also part of his pendulum moves aimed at Pyongyang. So that said, the so-called war crisis on the Korean Peninsula in 2017 was, I think, largely a creation of Trump's chest-thumping rhetoric against North Korea and the frenetic media coverage, if you will, mainly in the US and South Korea, of rhetorical war between the US and North Korea. So in that sense, I think the media coverage of the war crisis provides a variety of aspects that deserve deep analysis. And obviously, Trump knew exactly how to attract media attention, and he loved the attention. He knew that he had to make the American people and the US allies believe the war may be imminent so that he could impose a credible threat to North Korea. And the media reports played an important role here, I think. So it doesn't matter whether it's conservative or liberal media, probably the media outlets enjoy the flood of news reports to be consumed by their readers and viewers. So I think in that sense, CNN, for example, must be in a love and hate relationship with Trump. And I would like to ask our presenters to what extent the Korean presidential election in May of 2017 had to do with the public's growing anxiety about the so-called April war crisis and the media's intensive coverage of this possible war crisis in April. And I'd like to also mention, unlike the previous US presidents, Trump worked for himself as his personal spokesman by constantly sending out Twitter messages. So from the media's point of view, no matter how serious or credible the messages are, or whether you support Trump or not, they are to be reported. You can't just ignore what the President of the United States said in public. So that's why my reporter friends from Korea in Washington complained about the constant news stories about the Korean Peninsula coming from Trump himself. They really wanted to take a break without success. Let me briefly discuss the limitation of access to news source that the Korean media faces when it comes to their coverage in Washington of the US policy towards the Korean Peninsula. So many times I found my Korean friends tend to read too much into the official statements made by the White House, State and Defense Department spokespersons. The Korean news outlets try hard to capture the nuance in the statements. And sometimes they are really successful compared to the American media that don't pay close attention to Korea issues unless we have a serious provocation from North Korea. No offense to Tim. However, I also found that a delicate change of wording not always mean there is a delicate change of US position. So to verify that, you will need an access to other news source in the Biden administration, for example. But that's not easily available to the Korean reporters in Washington as a foreign media. So many times it is the Korean government source that the Korean news media gets sensitive information from about the US position. And Korea experts in Washington who have connections to the White House, the State Department, or DOD could be another source. But for those whose term is only about 3 years and who have to work overnight on a daily basis as a reporter, it is not an easy job to aggressively network with the Korea experts in Washington. So I think because of this, challenges, the Korean media is having some difficulties in covering the news coming from Washington, and probably they may want to, increase their manpower and resources to better cover the U.S. policies and the news stories coming from Washington. Let me stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Director Kim. And now back to our presenters here. Professor Lee, would you give your answers to our discussants' comments? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your wonderful comments and questions. And actually, to some of the questions, I don't have any answers, but because I have been teaching the course titled "The Korea-U.S. Relations in Yonsei University" to the exchange students for some years, but most of the students are from the United States, and I know that from firsthand the experience that the most of the current the U.S. students knows more about the details of the Korean history and especially the North Korean issues probably more than better than I do. So. So about the Trump factors, as Director Kim and the Chief Martin says, I'm not sure whether that is probably that is the Trump factor, but the increased volume of the news, significant dramatic increase of the volume of the news about the Korea-U.S. relations is because of the Trump's personal personality or increasing importance of the relationship between the United States and Korea and in terms of the North Korean issue, probably the combination of these two. But one thing that I can say is that judging from the decreased volume on the news during the Biden administration, it seems true that Trump was the factor. But about the Chief Martin's the question about the converging or diverging of the Korean newspapers. I think that there were some points before, as far as I know, before 1990s, there was not much difference in the Korean news media about their description or tone of the news articles about the United States, even if there were some anti-Americanism issues in the 1980s, but the issue was first the clash or the difference of the opinions about the U.S. First appeared in the Korean news media in the early 1990s when the transfer of the operation control issue was discussed first, and then in 2002 Yangju-hae incident, and then 2008 U.S. beef protest. These two were two of the significant moments when the Korean news media diverged between the conservative and the progressive. But during the Trump administration, probably I think the volumes of the news articles increased, but as far as I see, there was not much difference in terms of the newspaper tones of the newspaper articles. More the conservative, regardless of the conservatives or liberals, both of them became more nationalistic, and because their description is the Trump is somewhat a little bit seems out of mind because he's in extraordinary demand for the increase of the defense budget or other kinds of the strange requests. So, but after in the Biden administration, I could sense that some diverging the tones between the conservative and liberal media. For example, in the recent case of the withdrawal of the American troops from the Afghanistan, conservative media tended to describe that what would happen to Korea if the United States somehow decides to withdraw from Korea, that kind of thing. But that is the tone of the conservative media. But the liberal or progressive media says that the South Korea is different from the Afghanistan. So that kind of the things will not happen. So but whenever I realized that whenever there is some kind of issues about the U.S. and Korea, so especially during the Moon administration in Korea, the divergence of the tones of the newspapers can be observed there. I think, and I totally agree with the Vice Director Kim's the observation that the Korean media needs some more access to the American news. As I think in 1974, one of the media specialists, Lance Bennett, wrote that something like that, on the basis of the American the media government relations, because the media is limited in their resources, it is inevitable to just follow or base their news articles on the government announcement, or it is inevitable at the time. But still, it seems to be true in Korea, because there is no other source than the Korean government official announcement, because even if there were a lot of the special correspondents or reporters the stationed in the United States, as far as I know, their sources are also based on the U.S. reports, something like the CNN or NBC News or the ABC News. So yeah, I think I totally agree that the Korean news also need more access to get the insider information about the U.S. the workings of the U.S. governments and foreign policy. And to illustrate the one of the last point, the Professor Kim Jun-hyung mentioned the gaslighting. That is very interesting word to describe the Korea-U.S. relations. Because the Korean government tends to be, how can I say that the voluntary servitude, that kind of the attitude, to illustrate some aspects of the Korean newspapers' attitude toward the U.S. government. So I think that was severely criticized by conservative medias, but from some the liberal medias and progressive medias, I think that probably he has some points. I just want to point that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Lee. And next, Professor Hong, would you give your answers to our discussants' comments? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I'm starting now. I very appreciate Professor Park Ji-young's pointing out my paper. Yes, and all of your comments are reasonable. I totally agree with your opinion. For further research, I think you have a good idea, so I want to consider my future research. I have 3 questions. Yes, and then the first one is, frankly speaking, I ran out of time, so I cannot analyze various kinds of media, and I only focused on one case. Yes, and then I'm going to consider your opinion for future research. And about number 2, it is a very good question. Yes, and then you question about the criteria of the group analysis. And I agree with your opinion, and I think who makes news is important because it is related with the content of news. For example, in case of mainstream media, there are lots of professional reporters when they make news, and editors' impact on the editorial process is large. In news organization, individual reporter cannot select the news item freely because there is a process of gatekeeping. As you know, gatekeeping is a process by which information is filtered to the public by the media. However, in case of a personal YouTube channel, I think they can produce messages freely without any restrictions. So sometimes they produce or they forward rumor or fake news. So I think their message is more sensational. So I want to compare the tone of message on the summit. However, I cannot find any difference because the political tendency is the most influence thing. So classification of YouTube author is important, I think. So, and number three, I think you have a very good point and very important thing. As Professor Park mentioned today, people's news selection is changing. Yes, and thanks to many kinds of news media, the political spectrum of news media is various. People select the media which are same to their political tendencies. So today we can find, as you know, confirmation or bias of people when they consume news. So we can find the polarization of people in our society when they hear sensitive issues. So I think I needed to consider how people use, how people select news and what is the most important thing which affect their perceive of the reality, I think. And Professor Kim Yonho's opinion, I totally agree with your opinion. So for solving this issue, I think there are few reporters who can report the North Korea issue or the relations between Korea and the US in depth. News on North Korea had an amateurial insight to it, I think. So North Korea issue or relations between Korea and the US issue is closely connected with US, so we need lots of experts who can cover and who can see North Korea issue and relations between the Korean US issue deeply. I think because there is a limited number of news sources who can tell about North Korea, who can tell about relations between Korea and the US. So I think the rule of correspondents who are in New York, in Beijing, and in Tokyo is important because they can access lots of overseas experts. That concludes my opinion.
Thank you very much, Professor Hong. Yeah. And so does anyone want to add something before we wrap up this seminar? Or just please feel free to raise your hand if you have anything you want to share with us. Yeah. Okay, so let's wrap up today's seminar then. So through Professor Lee's presentation, we discussed whether there's a difference in how the media describe the US-South Korea relations, depending on the media's political orientation, and where were the historical change points in the media, in how media portrays the US and the US-South Korea relations. Also, through Professor Hong's presentation, we discussed how Korean newspapers frame relations between the US and South Korea, such as the Moon-Biden summit, whether newspapers have different media agenda according to their political tendency, whether new forms of media such as YouTube spread agenda that is different from the traditional media, or whether different YouTube channels have different agenda depending on the channel types. So I think one of the biggest takeaway from today's seminar is that it is apparent, well, we saw the data that Korean media describe the US-South Korea relations differently depending on their political orientation. And how is that specifically affecting the US-South Korea relations? That would be the question that needs further investigation, probably in another seminar. So this was the fourth of the 6 seminars scheduled for the 2021 ROK-US Think Tank Seminar Series. And thanks to our distinguished participants, we were able to have high quality, constructive discussions regarding how Korean media portrays the US and US-South Korea relations. I would like to thank you all and have a good rest of the day, Professor Lee, Professor Hong, Chief Martin, and Professor Park, and Director Kim. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.